Um, Give me one moment. I'm going to make sure that this is working. Good. Okay. Thank you everybody for joining. Um, we are holding now in our last sheet. We ended off with the bracha, the 13th bracha. That is the bracha of the tzaddikim. My 13th, 14th bracha. I'm losing count at this point. Wow. So the bracha of tzaddikim, as we discussed last week, was a bracha where the bracha of tzaddikim was a bracha which began as two separate brachot in the earlier times of Chazal, in the time of the Tanaim. And eventually it was chosen unanimously to have that bracha become a composite prayer. One which was not talking about tzaddikim and gerim separately in two brachot, but rather one bracha for both tzaddikim and gerim. And last week we pondered the history of that change, and really of that choice. Why to include the bracha about gerim in the bracha of tzaddikim, and why would perhaps gerim have been a big part of the lives of Jews in the time of Rabban Gamliel? Tonight we're going to discuss the next bracha. This bracha of Binyan Yerushalayim is, of course, a very important bracha for people living in the time of Rabbi Gamliel B'Yavnek, directly after the Churban. And if the Shemoneh Esrei has a message, if the Shemoneh Esrei is a message of Geula, or if its focus is Geula, this becomes the climax of the Shemoneh Esrei, the prayer to Hashem, the direct request for the rebuilding of Yerushalayim, and the restoration of the monarchy and the subsequent bracha. Now, nobody knows for sure if this bracha predates the Churban, because in the current state of affairs, the way we have the bracha as it stands now, it asks for the restoration of Yerushalayim, the building of Yerushalayim, which insinuates that means Yerushalayim has been destroyed. However, it is not impossible that earlier versions of this bracha simply were brachos for the mercy for Yerushalayim, for the protection of Yerushalayim. And various scholars have suggested that perhaps the original Chatima was Habocher B'Tzion or Hashochin B'Tzion. And that originally, before the Churban, this bracha in some form or another already existed. Now, in order to do this bracha justice, I'm going to have to recap some of the material we did earlier in our introduction to the Shemoneh Esrei. Now, really in our introduction to studying Jewish liturgy. So originally, and the reason for this is because the Bracha B'nai Yerushalayim is central to the discussion about how to study the Amidah and what are the facts about the early nuschaot of the Amidah and of Tefillah in general. So the earliest scholars of Jewish liturgy, of Tefillah, were part of the Wissenschaft des Judentum, the reform, not just the reform, but the push for scientific study of Judaism. Some of the scholars there were Reform, some were not. But the earliest scholars, such as Leopold Zunz and Ismar Elbogen, took it for granted that the Tefillah was a text to be studied like any other ancient text. And Zunz in particular was trained by German philologists who were experts in studying ancient texts. And when it comes to ancient texts, especially works of literature like poetry and stories, etc., we know that there is something called an urtext. There is an original text, right? If it was written by an author, the poet or a poet, there was an original text. And the challenge of a philologist is to reconstruct the original text as it was written by the author, and to unpack the layers of what of the development, the diachronic history of how the text developed over time, layer by layer. That was their agenda. When they approached Tefillah, they approached it no differently than any other ancient text that they were used to studying. They were accomplished classicists. They all understood and were very familiar with classical and texts from antiquity. And so as experts in Judaic texts, they set their methods of philology to tefillah. And it wasn't until Rabbi Yosef Heinemann came along in the 40s and the 50s, and he entered this field, that he began to question this assumption. And that is the assumption of studying philologically is that somebody at some time came along and instituted the prayers as we know it. And all the prayers and the variations and the rites that we have today are corruptions of those earlier institutions. And all our current tefillah nuschaot, all of our current texts are corruptions of those earlier ones, and we have to deconstruct it. Yosef Heinemann argued on this, and he said, no way. Essentially, he took the form critical school of text criticism, and he argued compellingly that in the earliest times, in the earliest times of Jewish prayer and the development of Jewish prayer, there were many social groups and different social settings where prayers would occur, whether they be in the Beis HaMedrash, whether they be in the Beis HaKnesses, whether they be in the Beis HaMikdash, or a Beis HaMishta, meaning in a place of celebration, time of Kriyas HaTorah, etc. So in these earlier settings, there were various social groups that developed their own, let's say, prayers or prayer forms to accompany the various life cycles, various prayers, and various needs. What Rabbi Gamliel did b'Yavne was not institute out of thin air 18 brachos. What he did is that he took 18 brachos that had already been formulated slowly, but over time. He took 18 brachos or 18 topics that had been formulated, and he instructed people to say 18 brachos at 18 topics, one after the other, one about avos, one about gvuros, one about kedushas, one about das, one about slicha and tshuva, etc., etc. But he never gave anybody a nusach. That would have been superfluous. There were dozens of different nuschais of the Shemoneh Esrei, and people picked and chose as they wanted. And as we find in the Gemaras in many places, the Chazanim used to embellish and subtract and increase as much as they wanted. They were competent, and that's how they recited the Shemoneh Esrei. But there was never an or text to the Shemoneh Esrei or the Berachas HaYotzer or anything like that. It would be silly to hunt for one, because that just wasn't the reality in the time of the Tanaim. Even developing into the time of the Amoraim, there was no or text. There was no official text. People did, the Chazanim did as they saw fit, and eventually over time, the most favored forms, the most favored brachos were solidified. Central to Rabbi Yosef Heinemann's argument was the bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim, because the bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim is found in so many different forms. We find it in Berachas Hamazon, which is called the bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim, and it ends Berachat Hashem Bnei Yerushalayim, and it begins Rachem Hashem Elokeinu al Yerushalayim etc., etc. We find it in on Tisha B'Av, Nachem Hashem Elokeinu really begins Rachem Hashem Elokeinu. We find it in Berachas Haftarah. We find it in Berachas Chasanim. There are multiple places in our liturgy where we find a bracha for Binyan Yerushalayim, and all of these different forms, if we look at the earliest types, are kind of similar. They all have the same form. They begin with a rachem. They go al, and the chasimas might not have been the same, but what seems here is that all of these brachas could have been used interchangeably. One of his biggest rayas, as we'll see soon, is that the nusach of Eretz Yisrael for the bracha of Shemoneh Esrei is almost identical to the bracha of what do you call it? Berachas Hamazon. The rachems are just so similar that it must be that they were interchangeable prayers, and you could have said the bracha for Shemoneh Esrei for the Haftarah, and the one for the Haftarah Berachas Chasanim, and you could have interchanged them. This was a very influential opinion that what's it called, carried much further than just the 60s or 70s after Yosef Heinemann died. But in the coming decades in Eretz Yisrael and in any school of liturgy, they accepted his view because that seemed to be the most sensible take, and his proofs seemed to be substantial and credible. It wasn't until the early 2000s, or perhaps it began in the late 90s, really, when the next great scholar, Ezra Fleischer, dipped his toe into this arena. Now, Ezra Fleischer's background was a scholar of Piyut, but at the end of his life, he began to take a stance against the base of Heinemann because he believed that Heinemann had some fundamental errors in the history of the Shemoneh Esrei. And essentially, without going into the fine details, because the back and forth is incredibly complicated. What Esther Fleischer essentially argued was that it must be that if Rabbi Gamliel Biyavne was making a takana for the entire Klal Yisrael, that he created an official nusach. It is not possible nor rational to say that he is going to make an institution that the entire Klal Yisrael has to listen to, and yet not give them a nusach with which to pray. If there's no evidence for Shemoneh Esrei before the institution at Yavne, and then after Yavne we have Shemoneh Esrei, it must be that Rabbi Gamliel instituted an actual nusach, because otherwise it wouldn't be a feasible takana. It just doesn't make sense. How could you make such a takana? You can't make a takana without a nusach. That was the effective argument. And therefore, he believed that there was an or text, and it eventually branched off into the Nusach HaBabli and Nusach Yerushalmi. But what happened was that the piyutim from Eretz Yisrael, all the paitanim who embellished and changed the Nusach of Shemoneh Esrei for special occasions, corrupted the Shemoneh Esrei that was the or text irreparably. It's impossible to reconstruct and reverse engineer what the original Shemoneh Esrei was, because it's been so irreversibly damaged by the piyutim from Eretz Yisrael. That was his position, and without what do you call it? And that's the simplified version of his argument. And Bnei Yerushalayim, therefore, since it was so critical to the discussion of to this core argument, this main controversy became a special area of interest for scholars that came afterwards. Namely, one of the more important ones is Uri Erlach, who published a very important book, Tfilas Amidah Shleimei Sachal. He recognized that if we look at this bracha more closely, we might be able to find proofs for or against Ezra Fleischer and for or against Rebbeisov Heinemann's position. And so that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. We're going to take a look at the earliest sources. We're going to try to deconstruct our own view, and we're going to try to reconstruct our own view as to the history of the bracha of Binyan Yerushalayim. I hope we have enough time to do the time of both the Tanam Amoraim as well as the Rishonim. Okay, let's first look at the earliest source we have. This is the Tosefta. We saw this multiple times. Shemoneh Esrei bracha Shamar Chacham Keneged Shemoneh Esrei Askar Shebahu L'Hashem B'nei Elam. Kail Shalminim B'Shal Prushim B'Shal Gerim B'Shal Zakenim B'Shal David B'Bnei Yerushalayim. Imam Mar Elu La'atzman Ve'elu La'atzman Yatza. The Tosefta essentially says that there are 18 brachas in Shemoneh Esrei, and there has to be 18. However, this order or this number is not so official. You just have to get to the number 18. If you want, you could have a separate bracha for minim and a separate bracha for prushim, or you could combine them. You could have a separate bracha for gerim and a separate bracha for tzaddikim, or you could for zakenim, or you could combine them. You could have a separate bracha for David, and you could have a separate bracha for Bnei Yerushalayim, or you could combine them. However, if you say each one separately, you are yaitze. Now, the text I'm showing you on the screen here is a little bit misleading, because the original nusach of the Tosefta, the best nusach that we have, is Shel Gerim v'Shel Zakenim v'Shel David b'Yerushalayim. It doesn't say Bonei Yerushalayim. It doesn't quote the Chatima, the last part of the bracha. And what we find in the Gemaras that quote this Tosefta is that the Gemaras are reworking, or they have inherited a reworked version of this Tosefta, because on the first hand, the Gemaras quote it both in Bavli and in Yerushalmi. They quote it with the Chasimas. They'll say V'Shal Gerim or we'll say B'Shal Minim B'Shal Machnia Zedim, V'Shal Gerim B'Shal Miftach LaTzadikim, or V'Shal David B'Shal Bnei Yerushalayim. And also, the Gemaras will exclude Amar Elu Latzman Ve'elu Latzman Yatza. that you could be yaitse by putting them separately. And you could put them, what do you call it? And that you can separate one from the other. So what happens is when we find it, which we find in many Gemaras and Brachos and in the many Gemaras from the Yushalmi and in Brachos, in the Yushalmi or Shoshana and Yushalmi Brachos, we find multiple rayas from the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael that in Eretz Yisrael they chose to separate to combine the brachas of Bnei Yerushalayim and David. So just like in Nusach Bavli, we combined Ger and Bishal Zakenim, they combined David with Bnei Yerushalayim. Okay, so far so good. But what this Tosefta is telling us is that first of all, we cannot verify that the Chatima of Bnei Yerushalayim is ancient. We don't know what the Chatima is. All we know is the content. Vishal David Yerushalayim. We know it's a Beracha Yerushalayim. And number two, that by the time of the Amoraim, it became official to have them as one in Eretz Yisrael. But in the Talmud Yerushalmi, we don't find this last sentence. Amar Elu Atzman Ve'elu Atzman Yatza. Sounds like in the Yerushalmi, they didn't believe that you could be yaitse by doing them separately. They believed you had to do them together. While in the Nusach HaBavli, we see the opposite, that they chose in the Nusach HaBavli to put them separate. Let's look at the Gemara in Megillah Daf Yud Zayin Beis. Vehechad Mr. Memes Karnam, where the tzaddikim going to have their horns exalted. Be'Yushalayim, Shenemar Shalu Shalayim Yushalayim Yishlay Avayach. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They who love you shall prosper. Bekivan Shenimnes Yushalayim Ba David. And once Yushalayim is built, comes David. Shenemar Achir Shubnei Yisrael Bikshel Shem Lekechem Ves David Malcolm Bekivan Sheba David Basat Tefillah. That's the rest of it regarding Shemeat Tefillah. We see very clearly that in the Nusach HaBavli, they already, the Nusach HaBavli already includes Berachas David as a separate bracha. Furthermore, if you look at the Havinenu of the Nusach Yerushalmi, the Havinenu only has a bracha for Yerushalayim, and the Havinenu of Bavli has a bracha for David as well. Okay. Now, you're going to have to forgive everyone. I hope everyone will forgive me that I'm not as prepared as I need to be with as many slides. Unfortunately, fortunately, we had a family wedding this week. So if I'm behind on the slides, it's for a Mazel Tov reason. Okay, so let's look at this Gemara together. Amr B'Yehuda Amarav. This is a Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph. Very famous Gemara. It's talking about the sin of David HaMelech. Amr B'Yehuda Amarav Lo Ilam Al Yavi Adam Asmei L'Dei Nisayon. A person should never bring himself to a situation of nisayon, of challenge or test. Shari David Melech Yisrael Haviat Smoli De Nisayon V'Nichshal. Even David, the king of Israel, brought himself to a situation of challenge and stumbled. Amar Lefan of Ribbon Shalom. He said to Hashem, Epnei Ma Omrim Elokei Avraham Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov Ve'ein Omrim Elokei David. Why is it that in Shmona Esrei they say they mention the patriarchs and they don't say Elokei David? Amar inu minsuli vatlo minsitli. He said, well, they were tested before me. You weren't tested before me. Amar lefana Ribbon Shalom b'chaneni v'naseni. Hashem, please try me and test me. Shenemar b'chaneni Hashem v'naseni. This Gemara takes for granted that the Shmona Esrei contains the three avos, but it does not contain anything about David HaMelech. While we find the exact opposite in the Nuschais of Eretz Yisrael. In the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael, the bracha ended with Beracha Hashem Elokei David Bnei Yerushalayim. They combine the two. Says the Gemara, "V'sisali Shem Gadol Kashem Agdayim." Let's pasuk in Shmuel. Mikan kavu Chachamim Elokei David Bnei Yerushalayim. This is why the Chachamim instituted the Nusach of Elokei David Bnei Yerushalayim. Kineged Elokei Avraham Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov. Because it parallels the three patriarchs. Straight up, the Gemara is not mincing words. It's not the Gemara. The Medrash is not mincing words. The Gemara is the Medrash here specifically is explicitly contradicting the Bavli. While the Bavli holds there's no parallel here, there's no corresponding mention of David and Shmona Esrei. Medrash Shmuel holds there is a corresponding Elokei David and Shmona Esrei, and David is considered to be one of the patriarchs. Now, one of the things we're going to see, especially we saw that in the Havinenu, it says B'nei Betcha. But what we'll see in the, I wonder if I have the Nusach. I'm sorry if I didn't prepare a slide. Give me 1 second. If I could give you the Nusach of the Havinenu. Bear with me, please. Sorry. I think it is. I guess I'm not finding it quickly enough. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to anybody who's listening. It's just going to take me a second. Yes. V'yismechu tzadikim bebinyan irachu betikun heichalach. Tikun heichalach means the Beit HaMikdash. V'yismechu kachosebach bebinyanach irach bechudushe Beit Miktashach. That's another version. And then what's called Midrash Rabbi Shimon Levi, we have Hachra Kamenu Achas Kamenu Tzedekenu Mishpat, completely skips. It says Bnei Beitcha Tzidkatenu, Bnei Beitcha Ushma Tiratenu. Essentially a mention of the Beit HaMikdash. So we find three topics in the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael. We find the Binyan Yerushalayim, we find Binyan Beis HaMikdash, and we find Malchus Beis David. Three separate topics that are attested to. And we find, because the Havinenu says Bnei Beitecha, it led scholars to suspect that the earliest version of the Nusach Eretz Yisrael also had Bnei Beitecha. And as we found in the Kair Geniza, it indeed did. Look here in front of me. Rachim Hashem Elokeinu b'rachmecha rabim al Yisrael, amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha v'al Tzion mishkan k'udecha v'al hichalecha v'al meonecha v'al malchut Beit David Mashiach tzidkecha. This one doesn't have it, but Baruch atah Hashem Elokei David u'bnei Yerushalayim. I wonder if I could skip quickly enough to find you that chart that I wanted to show you. Here we go. Look at these early versions that we have from the Geniza. I hope my video is not blocking what you need to see. But if you look here, the Nusach that was found in the Kair Geniza for the Nusach Eretz Yisrael is almost identical to the Nusach that we had, not almost identical, but very similar to the Nusach that we have for Birkat HaMazon. And it goes as follows. Rachim Hashem Elokeinu b'rachmecha rabim al Yisrael amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha v'al Tzion mishkan k'vodecha v'al heichalecha v'al meonecha v'al malchut Beit David Mashiach tzidkecha. And some of them end b'nei beitcha v'shachlel heichalecha Baruch atah Hashem Elokei David bonei Yerushalayim. One or two of them is shorter. They say Al Yerushalayim yirecha b'rachamecha tashuv b'kisei David b'tocha tachin b'tishkon b'tocha. So it's brilliant to be able to compare these things to the other tefillot that we have. It must be understood that the Tefillat Amidah, has its own distinct history. You can't necessarily compare it directly to Birkat HaMazon or to the Birkat HaHaftarah. However, these comparisons of beginning with Rachim and then cycling with Al is really important. We even find, and I wish I could show you, but the Sefaria for some reason doesn't have Parak Lamed Vav of Ben Sira. Even in Ben Sira, which is so much earlier than the Gemara, Ben Sira has a tefillah which begins with Rachim al Yisrael Amecha and then goes on to say Al Yisrael Al and continues. So we see that format is really, really early. So now, while we have no idea what the Nusach was in the time of the Talmud Yerushalmi, and there are so many possibilities, especially because it originally in the time of the Tosefta, some people in Eretz Yisrael might have done it as two brachos. What we find hundreds of years later, around 500 years later in the Kair Geniza, seems to be that by the time of the latest Amoraim, Elokei David u'bnei Yerushalayim was definitely part of their nusach. Bnei Beischa was definitely part of their nusach. And it's very likely that Rachim was part of their nusach. So the nusach Yerushalmi, although we don't know it for sure, we have text from it in the various Gemaras in Yerushalmi. We have text from it from the Medrash. And we know that it's an approximation of what we have 500 years later in the Geniza. Again, it's really fun to compare it to other brachos like the Haftarah, Berachos Lasanim, Berachos Hamazayin, but the Amidah does have a distinct history and a distinct period, and that has to be kept in mind that the comparisons are not always perfect. Now, if we look at the Nusach of the Geniza more carefully, especially the Nusach Habavli and the Nusach of the Ga'inim, we come away with even more information. You see, Rabbi Yosef Heinemann would have looked at these brachas and said, look at the Nusach Habavli. If everyone looks at my screen here, you'll see that the major version of Nusach Habavli, 59 different manuscripts in the Kair Geniza, the most major version of Nusach Habavli was very similar to the Nusach Yerushalmi. Rachem Hashem Elokeinu al Yisrael Amecha Val Yishai Mirecha Val Heichalecha Val Mikdashecha Val Meonecha Val Tzion Mishkan Kvedecha V'nei Et Yerushalayim Binyan Olam Baruch Atah Hashem Bonei Yerushalayim. Everybody hearing that might scratch their heads and be like, wait, Nusach HaBavli? I thought I davened Nusach HaBavli. My Nusach's nothing like that. The fact is that in early medieval times, before the era of the Gaonim, before the era of, let's say, Rav Amram Gaon, everybody in Bavel was saying Rachem Hashem Elokeinu. They had a very similar nusach to the nusach of Eretz Yisrael. So Heinemann would take that as a tremendous support. Look, the original nusachos were all Rachem Hashem Elokeinu, and that's because these are all various different forms. But Uri Erlich decided to take a more careful look, and this is actually brilliant work. And it's great that in the decades later that we just had so much more information to work on to build upon these towers. Essentially, first of all, Al Yishai Mirecha, Berachim Tashuv, is reflected in the Siddur of Amram, right? Basically, this nusach of Al Yishai Mirecha is in Siddur of Amram. Second of all, the version of Rachem Hashem Elokeinu Aleinu V'Yisrael Machal Mirecha is reflected in Siddur of Sadia, two of the great Ga'inim. So we have in Bavel, we have the two versions, one that's similar. One that's Al Yushalayim Mirecha Berachamim Tashuv, the version we're familiar with today. The other is Rachem Hashem Elokeinu Aleinu, which is the dominant Nusach Eretz Yisrael, and also at their time the dominant Nusach HaBavli. So what exactly happened? If you look at this Nusach HaBavli, this new one here, right, that's very different than the Nusach Yerushalmi. It's very odd because while the Nusach HaYerushalmi, which is begins with Rachem, is a very typical bracha of Binyan Yerushalayim. This bracha is very new and very different. It speaks about the return of Klal Yisrael, which the other one doesn't, right? Rachem doesn't speak about the return of Klal Yisrael. It doesn't say Tashuv. Second of all, it talks about the Shechina, V'tishkon b'tocha, and you should rest in it, kasher dibarta, which is also not part of the Rachem version of Binyan Yerushalayim, both in Berach Samazin and here as well. So if you were a betting man, you'd look at this and be like, Al Yushalayim Mirecha, Berachim Tashuv, B'tishkom B'tocha, Kasher Dibarta. That sounds poetic. That sounds like those are stanzas. So if you were a betting man, you would say, okay, there's no mention of the Beis HaMikdash. They took out Beis HaMikdash. There's an idea of returning to Eretz Yisrael. There is this mention of Shechina, and it rhymes. Or almost rhymes. And that sounds like poetry to me. So if you held the position of Ezra Fleischer, you would venture to say that this is nothing more than just a poetic reworking. And it wasn't until 1984 that we actually had evidence for this. There was a piyut yud chet, meaning a pre-classical piyut. Pre-classical means that it's from the 400s, the times of the late Amoraim, which was discovered and dissected by Shulamit Elitzur. And looky here what we have here. We have a nusach of the Shemona Esrei, which is a poetic. This is called a piyut Shemona, a krovat yud chet. I'm sorry. This is a krova designed for, let's say, Purim, or let's say a day where you're going to say Hanukkah, a day where you're going to say 18 brachas of Shemona Esrei, but you need a poetic version. Look what we have here. We have every bracha poetically reworked, like let's say Miftach LaTzadikim, Netzor Yisharim Chesed Amlam V'Sameach I don't know what that word is. Alecha Ba'amet Baruch Atah Hashem Miftach LaTzadikim, and then we have Al Yerushalayim Yirach Birachamim Tashuv Kisei David B'toch Atachin Baruch Atah Hashem Elokei David Bonei Yerushalayim. We have an explicit Krovat Yud Chet which uses this nusach, and what's more is that if you accept that this is the earliest version of this, you're accepting that this pre-classical piyut or piyutim like it are the source for this later, this alternative version of the Bracha Bonei Yerushalayim. Now, what's more is that other scholars have found that there was this habit among Chazanim in early medieval times in Bavel, and even in Eretz Yisrael, there was a habit that some of the Chazanim, sometimes during Shemona Esrei, they would say most of the brachot according to the Nusach HaKeva, and then for one or two brachot, they would just choose a nusach mifuyata. They would just take a poetic version. We don't know why. Maybe they just like the poetic version more. But even on a regular weekday, sometimes they'd say, you know what, I like that other poetic version better. And they would just shtup that in and say that one instead. We do find this. So it is very convincing that this nusach of Al Yushalayim Irach is simply a poetic reworking, which bolsters the position of Ezra Fleischer. Because originally we have a uniform nusach hakeva, Rachim Hashem Elkeinu Al Yisrael Amecha, and then some guy writes a piyut in Eretz Yisrael in the 400s, and he irreparably, and irreversibly destroys the ability for us to see what the original bracha was. This is really, really brilliant stuff. Now, of course, if you're Ezra Heinemann, what you're going to argue is that, true, this might be a poetic reworking, but essentially we still see that there is a model of Rachim, which begins as early as Ben Sira, and then trickles down to multiple different Binyan Yerushalayim versions. So again, it's very difficult to be machriya here. But if you're looking at the raw data, the raw evidence of Binyan Yerushalayim, the evidence that we have from Binyan Yerushalayim doesn't support Heinemann's position as much as he thought it does. The later information that we have supports Fleischer much better, that there possibly was an or text, and Rabbi Gamliel B'Yavneh did decide on a nusach. Okay, really huge, really important, and I'm sorry to anybody who knows this better than I do if I oversimplified it, because there's a lot of text a lot of Gemaras I didn't show you in person, but I hope this made sense. Let me just recap before we continue. Essentially, there's two major opinions about how the Shemoneh Esrei developed. Was it originally one text which got corrupted later and developed into multiple nuschais, or were there always multiple nuschais and there was never an original text? When it comes to Binyan Yerushalayim, we find that Nusach Bavel and Nusach Eretz Yisrael differed substantially in the Chasima, but the earliest versions had a very similar body. The body began with Rachim Hashem Elkeinu Al, and then Al, just like the Bracha of Berachas Hamazon. We also find that the Nusach HaBavli retained, strangely, an early Eretz Yisrael piyut, which isn't even native to Bavel, and they would use that as an alternative prayer. Apparently, that became popular in the yeshivas in Bavel because of Amram Gaon puts that in his siddur, and that trickled down to all of the siddurim that were subsequently adopted by the rest of Klal Yisrael. While the siddur of Sadia and other nuschais had Rachim Hashem Elkeinu Al Yisrael Amecha instead of that nusach, but the corrupted so-called poetic version became the most popular. Now let's look at the Sephardi and the Ashkenaz side by side, and I hope we have time. The Sephardi begins Tishko metoch Yerushalayim Yercha kasher dibarta v'kisei David avdecha meher b'toch hatachin uvnei ota b'meher b'meinu binan olam b'meher b'meinu baruch Hashem bonei Yerushalayim. You're going to find something very strange here, but I'll get to that in a second. That's the Sephardi version. Let's look at the Ashkenaz. Vil Yerushalayim Yercha barachim tashuv v'tishko metocha kasher dibarta uvnei ota. So, of course, we're doing Nusach HaBavli. We're only talking about Yerushalayim, right? But wait a second. Why does it talk about David HaMelech? If you paid attention at the previous slide, none of the Nusach HaBavli that we found in the Kara Geniza said anything about David HaMelech. It seems, and most scholars suspect, that it was an early, in the 1100s or so, there was somebody, somewhere, some why, who entered this idea of Kisei David Avdecha Beher B'toch HaTachin into the bracha of Yerushalayim. And we don't know why, we don't know when, we don't know how. Aaron Gabay, in his study on the Spanish Nusach, demonstrates that it's only in the later branches, meaning in the 1300s onwards, 1250s onwards, that we find that the Spanish Nusach adds this part about Kisei David. The earlier Spanish Nuschaot did it like they did in Bavel. No, nothing about David. We don't put David in Bonei Yerushalayim. This is a Nusach HaBavli. Why would you put David in Yerushalayim? And the reason for this has been completely lost. Nobody has any idea why the later versions of Nusach Sfarad added Kisei David Avdecha. However, Nusach Ashkenaz is even more mysterious, because the Nusach Ashkenaz, as far back as Machzor Vitri, as far back as we could find, Nusach Ashkenaz always had a Kisei David Meher B'toch HaTachin. Where does that come from? Why is that in there? It wasn't in Nusach Bavel. It's not Nusach Italia. It's not Nusach Romania. It's not the Nusach Teman. It's not the Nusach Aram Soba. Nobody did that. So exactly how the Ashkenaz did it or why they did it is a mystery of history. And some scholars even suspect that the Spanish borrowed it from them. Now, regarding the difference in structure, this is something Rabbi Yosef Heinemann looked at himself. He said the structure of the Sephardi one is even more suspicious because grammatically you would say shechon betoch Yerushalayim. You should rest in Yerushalayim, not tishkon, that you shall be rested. He's right when he says that most likely tishkon betoch Yerushalayim is, adjusted. That originally it said tishkon a little bit later in the stanza, ubi Yerushalayim tishkon, as we had. I hope I can show you here in one of these versions. Did I show it to you properly? Let me see. Yeah. Down, if you look here left on the Minag Bavel, Al Yushalayim Beracha Berachim Tashuv V'Tishkon B'Tocha Kasher Dibarta. He believes that it's a reworking of that. For some reason, somebody didn't believe in Tashuv. Somebody didn't believe that Hashem is going to return to Yerushalayim with the Shekhinah, that the Shekhinah is still there. It must be that there was somebody who decided that he was smarter than the Nusach Chazal, and that he decided that Eretz Yisrael still had Kedusha, didn't need the Shekhinah to come back, and therefore he adjusted it and started with Tishkon B'Tocha instead of putting Tishkon in the middle. That's a very compelling argument because grammatically this bracha simply doesn't make sense in the Sephardic version. And let me did I show that too quickly? I'm sorry. This is a siddur from Sfarad in the 1300s. Tishkon B'Tocha Shalom B'Ercha B'Mehera Kasher Dibartu V'nei Ota B'Nyan Olam B'Meher B'Amenu. And then V'Kisei David Meher B'Tocha Tachin. So it's a slightly different than the version. And again, that was what Heinemann suspected. So I'm glad he suspected that Bechisei David was actually at the end and not in the middle. So that was actually exciting to see. Okay, so regarding let me do that. Yes, screen sharing stopped. Okay, so regarding the modern nuschaot that we have seem to be developments of the medieval version. The medieval versions, for some reason, adopted, probably because of the Siddur of Amram, the alternative, Al Yushalayim B'Eracha, and then got reworked from there for the next few hundred years. I shouldn't have mentioned that Vil Yerushalayim Irach instead of Al Yushalayim Irach technically means you're saying El, like with an Aleph, instead of an Ayin, right? You're trying to say Ve'el Yerushalayim Irach. That's interesting. We don't know if that's a corruption because we find that very early. And I should also mention, we just ran out of time. The starting Kaddish, amen. But the Arizal, amen, endorsed saying David inside the Beracha of Yerushalayim. And that was because of a certain kavanah. I don't have my notes, my older notes on me to show you that kavanah right now. But amen, already in the Sidur Reish Pedala, the Sidur of 1523, already those Sidurim, the earliest printed Sidurim, were already printing the Kisei David inside the Bracha B'nai Yerushalayim, even in the Sephardi versions, and that's what the Arizal grew up with, and he endorsed that nusach. So I'm not going to say it's incorrect. Amen. I will, however, I will point out, however, that the original Sephardi nusach, the early medieval one, and most of Klal Yisrael did not add V'kisei David Avdecha Meher B'tocha Tachin. The Chasidei Ashkenaz, however, have a whole numerical thing for why there's a specific amount of letters in the Bracha of Yerushalayim Irach, and therefore they have, for them, you have to put in Kisei David. So, I mean, it has to come from somewhere. I don't know where. And Be'ezrat Hashem, if I have time next week, or if I find it when we discuss the Bracha of David, I'll bring more information when I find it. But thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for your time and attention. Be'ezrat Hashem, next week we will continue.